Fantastic. Thank you very much for the invitation to come. It's my pleasure to be here. I don't want to teach you anything. I'm going to talk about various things about I've experienced on the sort of travel through this process. And part of the story is going to be about this Department of Politics, Philosophy, and Religion, so I'm glad you liked it. Also as well, I won't be using a microphone. I'm originally, for those who can hear my accent immediately, I'm originally from the United States, so I'm automatically loud. What's happened? It's always like I'm always asked, would you like a microphone? I said, no, don't worry. And I'm also, I'll be flowing over a lot of slides and a lot of ideas. The slides I'm happy to give out. I'll touch stuff and we'll go past it. But if you want to talk about it later, if you want to talk about the issues, fine, great. And I'm happy to share. All the slides can be circulated. So if things get missed, the only thing I need is a clicker.
Yeah, it's right there for you.
Ooh, no. Ooh, got it. Oh, thank you. Okay, who am I? What have I done? So I've been working on complexity for the last 15 plus years. It keeps getting more and more. And almost as long as you count conference organizer here, who I checked, her first complexity publication was 1998. And that actually was a fantastic year for complexity publications, because that was when Paul Cilliers wrote Complexity and Postmodernism, and David Byrne wrote Complexity in the Social Sciences. So, good year. On the general side, there's Edgar Morin wrote a lovely short piece on complexity and defining it, what we call it general and restricted. Restricted was more, if you will, a more focused in terms of a much more defined sense of complexity. I tend to be the more general debate. I was recently at Stanford University where I met a lot of what I would consider restricted complexity people that were viewing, in a sense, trying to compress complexity down almost in a linear way, that I felt, all of a sudden I realized, yeah, this is a very different direction than what's going. Those were computer scientists. Mm-hmm. To me, complexity is a meta-theoretical framework with fractal properties. What excites me so much, and when I'm teaching the students, is we can talk about a global structure, we can talk about an institutional. I always use hospitals, because I've got a good friend of mine who's a manager, chief executive officer of a hospital. I'll use him, and the university. And then for me, then there's personal things about this, was I wrote a book on diabetes management as an individual level. How do you talk to students, individuals, managing complex situations in their own daily life? And the principles are all the same. And so in essence, you can take the same tools and the same concept, talk about an individual to a student. The trick I love to play on this complexity is to say, right, when are you getting married? Who's going to be your next boyfriend or girlfriend? How many children are you going to have? And say, well, look, we can quickly give you predictions of when you're most likely to do these things, but obviously you're working on that pathway through your life. How predictable is it? So for me, I'm very much on that sort of general side, etc. For some time, my work has been, how do you make complexity relevant and accessible to policy actors? And these are policy actors that are under a huge amount of pressure, and I'll get to explaining that in a bit. And then, I've never been good at staying in one place. As several people have accused me, I'm a bit of a happy puppy. I kind of jump around to things that interest me and that interact with my life. The diabetes was one thing, health and social policy, GP commissioning, that's general practitioner, hospital commissioning, international relations development. So in essence, it's always been the contacts that I've made and the people that I've interacted with that have often thrown me in certain directions that have enabled me to take. My co-author on complexity in public policy, Samir Rouhani, it was an Iraqi who moved to the UK in the 50s and still had family during the whole Iraq period. So writing on terrorism, writing on the war in Iraq, that took on a really personal relevance. So, where is complexity now? For me, I really like David Byrne's book, Byrne and Callahan, Complexity in Social Sciences, updated. Links science to the social sciences. This was something called the Gulbenkian Commission, wrote back in the mid-90s, same sort of thing. To me, it's a way of moving beyond a positivist, relativist debate, because I see complexity very much as a bridging structure. Because complexity recognizes there's order. You can always find order. There's all sorts of order, but there's disorder and there's complexity. And because you recognize all three, and there isn't a hierarchy, to me, everything that comes out of your sort of earlier modernist phase, etc., was all about creating the order bit is the good bit. Then it comes complexity, and then there's disorder. says that no, you're talking about a spectrum. There isn't a hierarchy of one being over. So in essence, the whole point of the social sciences is to create order. And to me, no, the whole point is to recognize what you're dealing with and to recognize that's what makes us, the human condition, the physical condition, etc. So for me, it's this bridging framework. Publish our own book to, big monster thing that's way overpriced. Steal it if you can. That's the Geyer and Kenny book. Geyer had a chapter in there. Steal his chapter. Funding multiple now multiple funding organizations, institute journals, etc. To me, complexity is pretty well mainstream. The word might not be used, but the meaning is out there. Lots of things are going. Lots of fields, are playing with these ideas, and lots of policy actors, at least the ones I've read. And personal conclusion, I always felt I've done well if I'm only trailing David Byrne by about 1 to 2 years. He's always been thinking faster than me. And so I'm always sort of like, okay, if I can be close enough to him, I'm doing okay. So I'm going to use the UK as a big example because that's what a lot of my work's been focused on. And if there's anything, I was just reading a book, Road to Somewhere, which is about Brexit and trying to draw out comparisons, and we can talk about that if you like. And I've always hated this extrapolation process. Somebody will take, and Americans and Brits are often terrible at this. They'll take the example of the US and the UK and then extrapolate it onto other countries. And that drives me crazy because I've always been a comparativist and haven't bounced with different countries, etc. The notion that you'll just take one system, and we as complexity people know this. You don't just pick up one system and plonk it into a new setting and assume it's going to work. So I'm going to focus on the UK, so you'll have to help me understand, bringing over the linkages into yours. Big challenge in the UK system. Strong, very powerful tradition of what's Westminster want, rational, centralized, hierarchical. Boy, oh boy, that comes through in new public management, evidence-based policy making, the language, better evidence equals better policy, better data, better outcomes. Huge targeting audit culture. Good is his friend. A friend of mine in the hospital, I was asking him, how many targets do you have to hit on a daily basis? And he sort of said, I asked the support staff to figure out how many. 368. I was like, how on earth do you do that? We don't pay attention to most of them. We pick 10, which are important, and we pay attention to those, because even those are interacting with each other. And the other 358 was just they kind of just get done. But this notion, more target equals better information, better control, better policy. Okay, and this is you're underlying your target audit culture. And then you had this, what was called Big Society, Bonfire of the Targets. This was under the coalition government, linked to this doing more with less. This was the politics of austerity that was coming out in 2010 after the economic crisis. Current phase, austerity is being used as a strategy of re-strengthening centralization. So if you like, the traditional tendencies within the British system are reasserting themselves through this period. Big problem, this tendency towards this. Evidence-based policymaking target. These are merely the latest manifestations. If you like, you can go back in history, you'll see the same things sort of repeating themselves. Obvious weaknesses, misdirected, blunt, over-controlling. UK, I would say, different systems are tipped in different ways. UK, it definitely is tipped too much. Austerity amplifies UK centralization by manages austerity predominantly through reducing local government expenditure. So in the UK, local government expenditures dropped 30 to 40%. So, when we're dealing with local actors, they're just sort of, we just can't do anything. They're literally down, the expression is cut to the bone. So they're merely applying what central actors are telling them exactly what to do. And it implements, there's something called the Northern Powerhouse, which is supposed to be the big initiative around Manchester, which is fundamentally about transferring responsibility of austerity away from the center to the localities, but you maintain fiscal control over it. So again, it's this transfer, it's not really decentralizing. Now, big sort of thing, what about Brexit? For me, austerity plus Brexit equals even greater centralization. Because what happens in the current political context, you've got the nature of the UK political system, that's what's called first past the post-electoral system, non-proportional. and a paralysis of the Labour Party right now, amplifies the Conservative Party agenda, which has historically been fairly centralist. Brexit opens up a whole wide variety of social, political, and economic positions. In other words, I see it very much as Brexit shakes all these political bargains. And the question is, who are the actors there sitting making the bargains? Now, if you're a conservative and you've been a centralized yourself, it's a great time. Okay? So it's absolutely marvelous. Key complicating factors: England, Northern Ireland, Wales, etc. And what's going to happen with the Scots? The Scots are really interesting. So all sorts of fascinating stuff going on. Well, what about the particular policies? What happens when you drop into certain policies? In the UK context, how does it affect health? Continual reorganization of the national health system. Okay? 23 major reorganizations over the last 20 years. It's absolutely incredible. Continuing long line of them. Political elites are what again, my good friend Samir Rahani said, it's the IMT syndrome, in my time. In other words, I'm the minister coming in for health. I come into the office and say, look what a mess this place is. And I put a lot of energy and effort in, and I'm going to sort it out. I'm going to organize the structure. Things will be made proper and kept, and they'll stay proper. In my time, I will save, in essence, I will save the system. And then, so then I either lose my job or I transfer over to somebody else. And the next person comes in and says, oh my God, what a mess this thing is. Boy, in my time, I'm going to fix this thing. And you have these cycles linked to the reorganizations of, in my time, I will reorganize. In my time, I will reorganize. You just see the waves. Does this help the NHS, the National Health System? Depends. Traditional Nordic approach, in a way, it's the only way to save the system. Central perspective, establishing printing, get the criteria right, and the system will save it. Complexity perspective, it may work. You might, in a sense, your shaking of the system might actually make that system function better in different ways, but it stifles learning, adaptability, flexibility in the long run. And local actors figure out, they're not stupid, they figure out how to resist, or they figure out how to ignore it. Oh, we're going to have a whole new reorganization, great. Which forms do I tick? Boom, boom, done, reorganization set. So, lots of things. In education, UK education policy, UK education children are now the most tested in the world. It is astounding the level of this. So the 2009 Cambridge report on this, their most evaluated schools, the most tested students, huge costs, all of this, large diversion of resources to that, moderate to minuscule improvements over the UK position. Recent changing, re-centralization of all funding. Again, the local authority cuts. Education has now been re-centralized. Control over testing, increasing political control over testing. Testing was seen to be too easy by the minister, Michael Gove. Said, right, we're going to make it harder. And what's fascinating, surprise, surprise, yes, all the people who are evaluating testing then started marking harder and harder on the process because they responded to these political demands. Works for elites. Elites are always able to adjust and adapt to the situation. They buy in tutors, they get help, they find their way around it. But for the rest, it's been pretty much stagnation in terms of education. If you're interested in how, this is one of the best, this was Eileen Monroe from the London School of Economics, did the Eileen Monroe review into child protection. In terms of social policy, this is the best thing I've ever seen on a nasty, difficult area of child protection. Talk about working in a hard area of applying complex and systems theory thinking to this area in a policy-relevant way. Lovely report, freely available. Type in Eileen Monroe. The Monroe Review was concluding that the thing is, in essence, in social policy, we have horrible outcomes. Parents torture a child to death. How can you accept this? You have terrible things. Well, how do you deal with it? You create more and more rules. So as she was explaining, a social worker in the 1970s had a book about 60 pages long that they would read. The book is now 680 pages. And in essence, they just tried to deal with complexity, unpredictable complexity, by then creating rules for a particular situation that occurs. Then a new situation occurs, new rule, new situation goes, and then accumulate the rules. Leads to us current systems. A skew in priorities to develop management, inspection processes are more important than actually trying to figure out what's the needs of the child, promotes following rules and compliant, operate over standards, performance data collected, great effort spent, doesn't describe what really matters. So you check, has the child been such and such, has the parents done such and such, you're collecting all this data. The data doesn't tell you that much. Because you're dealing with a highly complex, often chaotic situation. New public management seeks to improve practice child protection through targets, performance, top-down regulation, media and the public perception of risk and the complex nature. Big thing, especially with child protection, the media loves it. Seeing a report that a child has been killed by their parents in horrific ways, boom, the media loves it, and the media wants a villain. The media wants order. They don't like complex systems. They don't want to hear some language about how difficult it is. They want to find the villain. And the villain's either the parents and or the social worker. So the social worker can get absolutely skewered by this process. And you'll have occasional suicides of social workers because of all the media that hits them. Overstandardized, problems of traditional policy, well known, and the government agreed with the review. Okay? No question. They said, yep, you're right. Absolutely right. Problem. And then, well, first I'll just say what she goes into is that she talks about how do you create a system where the children are being helped, creative, innovative response, feedback, essential, what you need is some essential prescription, but beyond that, you've got to let the social worker, in a sense, work with the family, work with the child, professional practice informed by research, evidence, competent judgment. Also one, and this is the big one, expect errors. Expect errors to happen. Try to catch them quickly, but expect them. Mistakes are normal. Be risk sensible. Okay? So really good stuff when you're talking about really emotive issues. Easy to say, hard to do. Okay? UK central action, often held responsible for local actions going on. This is the sort of the cost of centralization. The local actors throw up their hands and say, hey, look, you're the center of the ones who are in control. Hard to get away from. This is a constant expression. I hate it in the newspapers. Something must be done. This is a terrible case. A child has died in a horrific circumstance. Something must be done, and lessons must be learned. The problem is, everybody in this room obviously knows, we're dealing with a complex situation. The lessons from one situation aren't yet. They had a famous one. So there was one baby. The parents were abusing it, so they smeared the child's face with chocolate to cover up the bruising. Okay? So one of the rules that was put down was when doctors were viewing new babies, they should wipe their faces. And so rule 632, wipe the face of the baby, So, of course, the actor itself is an adaptive actor and says, oh, right, well, we know the doctor's going to wipe the face, so we've got to find some other way to, in essence, beat the child if this is going to happen. Okay? Again, nasty. It's a hard, nasty world. This is, dealing with this stuff. For many local actors, increased freedom, responsibility, and uncertainty is dangerous. It's threatening. Okay? Often local actors support targets to provide protection for themselves. Actually, in some ways, if they know they might get whacked with the system and attacked by the media, boy oh boy, you want to have something to fall back on. You want some rules and regulations. You want those 680 pages worth of rules and regulations to protect you. Okay? Local level, despite many doing amazing press and work, hey, local actors aren't angels. How do we monitor? How do we, in a sense, try to separate the good from the bad? They're not all perfect. The locality isn't the sort of the end-all solution. And wider societal values often play a key role. How to get society to accept some failure and occasional horrible injustice. And it's important to recognize this. Bad things are going to happen. You're never going to solve them all. Weakness of complexity in a UK context. How do you translate what is a meta-theoretical perspective into local action? How do you make complexity simple? This is David Byrne and Callahan, 2014. It's also it's also politically uninspiring. Well, being balanced. To me, when I'm speaking to students, you think Marx. Come on, free yourself from the change. You've got a world to win. For complexity, it's like, okay, hey, let's be balanced about it. Fundamentally, in a complex system, you're about balancing different aspects, etc. doesn't provide concrete answers, hard to sell uncertainty. You're going against complexity in a way is going up against the firms like KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, all these who are selling certainty to policy actors. They're coming in, they've got a fancy, we will audit your thing, we'll tell you what to do, we'll solve all your problems, and we're going to be very expensive, but we can do that. So you're constantly having to, in a sense, sell uncertainty. Against dominant media and political culture in the UK, lessons must be learned. Who is responsible for this, whether it's a tragedy, failure, etc.? Well, actually, it's part of these various things, etc. And how does complexity rent to democracy, power? Big questions. How do we act in an uncertain and complex world? For me, this took me into a link with a guy named Chris Ansel at University of California, Berkeley. Very, very nice guy. And we got into talking about how this links in with a tradition of what's called pragmatist philosophy, which in a way was me coming back to my American roots. I wondered whether, gosh, is there something inherent in me? I can't get away from this stuff. But if you've ever read John Dewey and his quest for certainty, he's talking in the 1920s, 1930s, where he's saying, and they're coming out, he is reflecting on this sort of early modernist way of we can sort society out, we know where we're going, and at the same time, he's trying to say, well, no, we're acting in a world of uncertainty. How do we pragmatically act with that? And pragmatism, to me, helps to explore a lot of the trickier bits of complexity, morality, what is right about complexity, action, what is to be done, power. What can complexity say to the weak? What do we say? And democracy and complexity, are they compatible? Democracy assumes control. We're voting for actors who are supposed to be able to control the situation. What do we mean by that? And for me, if anybody's interested, he was doing this work in the 2000s, lovely sort of touch on this. Ian Sanderson had a whole bunch of things in terms of policy, did some planning stuff as well. I really enjoyed his stuff, greatly influenced by Dewey and Majone, who is the European integration, European policy expert. Policy regulation planning, primary about continual experimentation, capacity for learning, modesty, and this is a big thing. I actually am, in a way, learning to be modest, and trying to sell modesty is actually an important thing. And I've come very much, particularly if you're dealing with policy actors. And there's a couple of things I could mention about how to structure things and things we've tried to do. Learning, continual learning, testing your policies is continually tested through democratic, and the truth can only be found through an engaged, democratic, and open approach. In other words, what is the truth? You're not looking for a final truth, you're looking for a continually changing truth that society is working through. And you can see boundaries on the truth of where that society is most likely to go, but exactly where it's going to be, forget it. Where's it? And I love to say to my students, what will the Conservative Party be arguing in 6 months' time? Whole way you can get boundaries on it. They'll have a market orientation. They'll have these various things. But the exact point, what is the narrative going to be? Where's the Labour Party be? Hopefully, have pulled itself out of the garbage it's in. One of the lovely ways I always like to do this, I don't want to take time on this because I don't want to talk too much. If those are familiar with Ralph Stacey's work on the Stacey diagram, I think is a lovely, simple tools to talk through with policymakers. Just hands, have anybody seen this before? Ralph Stacey's Stacey diagram? Oh, goodness, wow. Okay. Ralph Stacey had a big impact on me, and he was big. He came out of the management, sort of complexity and management thinking. And it's a lovely, I made a silly video on this thing if you want to, but we can come back to this and talk about this. But this is one of these simple things that I often say that when you're you're trying to convince a policy actor in a fast, efficient way and say, well, look, here's the different problems. And here's the way you need to think of those problems as opposed to just thinking in one evidence-based policy making that that's the best possible way to do things. Actually, there's multiple ways, and you're dealing with them all the time. So you've got political aspects, you've got attractive problems. Anyway, don't want to take time on this. Happy to come back to this and talk about it later if you like. So, what are we, the converted, all of you? Okay? It's supposed to be doing. In a way, hey, keep converting, you know, teach and do. That's what you're doing. You're converting right now, you know. Teaching, doing, interacting, bang, all good stuff. And in a way, I always put this in, this was Chris Ansel, a pragmatist call to arms, which is kind of ironic, it's all a bit of a mess. Despite uncertainty, engage and act. In the UK, there's something called the impact agenda going on. Is anybody familiar with what's called the impact agenda going on in the UK? What is the impact agenda in the UK?
You answer.
Oh, okay.
So with regards to higher education and focus on actually achieving impact in communities rather than publishing.
Excellent. Very much the thing that's happening in the UK, and it's fascinating, the UK higher education as a system has gone through a massive shift since I've been there. We had in the beginning of tuition fees. Previously it was what we think of as an allocative system. Universities got a certain amount of money that enabled them to take in a certain number of students. And it was an allocative system, then tuition free. It went into at least partial tuition system, then a full tuition system. But in a way, the conservative mantra on this has come very much as to a pointing at the universities. Right, you universities, you're getting all this money, all these resources being thrown in. How are you impacting on society? What is your research doing for society? And now 25, and then we have, anybody familiar with what's called the REF, Research Evaluation Framework, that we do every 4 to 6 years. Massive review of all the research departments that rank all the departments and positions you in the ranking system that determines the health of the and the financial health of the university. 25% of that is demonstrated through what are called impact case studies, showing your research, how impactful has your research been. 25% of that score comes out of that impact. So ironically, you're getting this stage where right now the UK universities are being beaten heavily to show their impact of their research and activities. So it's actually a really interesting period. It might be being done for the worst possible reasons, but the universities themselves are being driven to demonstrate how are you engaging, impacting with society. So I'm the new Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts Associate, well, not so new, a couple of years now, for internationalization. Internationalization, of course, of international linkages, research, recruitment. The UK universities are heavily reliant on international students. And my other hat is engagement, which links into this impact agenda. So for us, to convert it again, may not save the world, but we can do our best to nudge it in the right way. This sort of, optimism, and I realize very much from the pragmatist literature, we have to have a qualified belief in human nature, a relatively positive, qualified belief in human nature, because in essence, if you don't have that qualified belief in human nature, then being a complexity person is really hard, because, well, what's the point? And you're dealing with a complex situation, blah, blah, blah. You don't really think that human beings are capable of nudging in a good direction. For me, I kind of think if you're a complexity person, you almost have to have at least a bit of a positive view of human nature. Pragmatists engage what was called, Chris Ansel, democratic reflexive realism. You have to be realistic about what you're doing. You have to be reflective. And that notion of this, societies are fundamentally interactive. Democracy, by the way, I put in the broadest possible terms. I've been absolutely fascinated by China and the transition that they've been going through. And there's a couple of really interesting complexity people in China as well. And the kind of transition they're going through, but through a high-level authoritarian structure, but a low-level, very responsive, almost one could recognize as democratic at a local, regional level. So, fascinating contradictions. I'm not enough of a China expert to really claim anything, but I just find it fascinating. So what are my personal stories? My personal stories recently, I'll do a really personal one. So this is the transition from politics. I was made head of the Department of Politics. Right then, we were told, due to financial reasons, the Departments of Religion and Philosophy were going to be joining with politics to create this thing, PPR, Politics, Philosophy, and Religion. Okay? No clear plan, just get them together, make them financially. I remember I was told to make it a robust container. And I thought, oh, what the heck is that? A robust container. So key decision, I thought, okay, right, put my principles where my mouth is, and let's see if we can make this system function. Key decisions, focus on the basics, physical integrate. The smartest thing we did was we were put in a new building, was we alphabetized everybody. We said by their name. We said, right, we're not going to have a politics wing and a religious studies wing, a philosophy wing. We're just going to alphabetize you. And there was lots of stink about that, but we held on that. So everybody had to bump into everybody, got to meet your new neighbor, such and such. Isn't it terrible that this horrible head of department? You realize how much being a head of department, being a villain can be really useful. And that works its way up the university. You can always blame the villain, and you learn to kind of play the bad cop and the good cop, depending on which level you're in. Decision-making integration, we had a balanced management committee to represent, in a sense, 2 representatives from each of the 3 things. Culturally, try to work together to avoid factionalism, factional activity in academic departments. Multiple tensions going on, huge transition, this recruitment strategy. The political, each department has a political position within its larger faculty and university, and you have to sort of learn how to play those games. And multiple changes to the external system, mergers, fees, etc. Good news is, magically, and this is where, in a sense, with complexity, a lot of times you just shrug your shoulders, somehow it worked. People got working together, we managed to position ourselves, we did well, worked our way up the rankings, got the extra funding that enabled us to get more hires in, made what was an older group into a younger group, because we were able to hire a lot of new staff. And turns out, we wind up with a good culture that was quite positive and effective. Don't know about the future or how long it's going to last, but fundamentally we managed to sort of turn around what was 2 struggling departments into a robust container. It was like that. Somehow it worked. Failure. I was working with a group on what was called the Liverpool Social Sustainability Manifesto, tried to use complexity principles to guide a local political movement. Better understanding is what had gone on we were trying to, this is when this nudge unit, if you've heard of this, came out. We're saying, okay, let's do a coordinated push rather than just a little nudge in the right to this really meaningful positive change, making Liverpool a model of social sustainability passion. Try to involve local academics, social political parties. The 6 months worked on this, 6 months to 2 years, and basically it never really had the power, the push to do this. The actors never came together, the whole range of problems, but in a sense, it was just want to flag it up. Management is one that worked, but this one failed. The one I'm really interested in, and it's really fascinating if you're familiar with, and this links into the work of Judith Inez and David Boer, who did complexity and planning, Judith Inez at Berkeley, was this collaborative policy movement in the UK. It came out in the 1970s. Odd sort of thing. Came out of the 70s. They were trying to create these collaborative policy structures to find a way to avoid getting sued. Local governments were getting sued for all sorts of policy activity. And they were trying to integrate universities into the policy creation process to create a legal barrier so that lawyers wouldn't sue local governments as much. So there was no logical strategy behind it, just so happens this thing. But an interesting thing emerged out of it. Network of state and local governments, university collaborative policy centers, lots of different, about 40 to 50 of them. Embodied localism, complexity, in a sense, it was the embodiment of this complexity framework, pragmatist, also lots of different sort of, just an interesting thing to sort of look at. And in a way, I've been trying through my engagement hat to create a local collaborative policy unit within Lancaster that links to the 5 regional local authorities. And the interesting thing about that is, so this is my AD, Associate Dean for Engagement. How do we create those? How do we make those linkages? How do you build a relationship with 2 very different cultures and time frames for activity? So in other words, we're as academics, we can come here and spend 2-3 days on this. For local authority actors, at least the ones I'm dealing with in the UK, to get them for 2 hours is a miracle. They're absolutely pressed. And their decision-making time, they've got to decide between difficult issue, what do we do? The church is flooded, but the school is okay. how do we reallocate the structures from these things? And they have to do it with about a 2-week turnaround time. So how do you, in a sense, marrying up those relations, how do you create a connection between two very different cultures and organizational pressures and demands? And it actually is a really interesting thing. I mean, in a sense, I was thinking of this conference itself. One of the interesting things, just thinking about the structure when we were discussing it now. Yeah, why don't you invite a local policy actor to come in and say, actually, here's my problems right now. What can you do for me? And in a way, just listening to those problems and starting to make that connection can have a really powerful impact. So, big thing for this move away from this evidence-based policy concept towards a more reflective, knowledge-based relationship. In a way, I'm trying to sell to policy actors, look, don't rely on this idea that evidence-based policy, what you need is knowledge. Instead of evidence-based policy, which is assumed just get more data and you'll make better policy. Actually, what you need is better knowledge base. In other words, what is your knowledge base for doing that policy? What are you relying on? How are you thinking this through? And at these local authority areas that have had 30 to 40% cutbacks, who do you think they fired first? You got to lose 30 or 40% of your local authorities, local government staff. Who's it going to be? Number one on the
Those
list.
on the ground.
Anybody doing policy analysis, anybody doing studies and things, they're gone. You hang on to all the frontline staff who are delivering the actual policy, but you strip out any knowledge-based capacity because those are the ones you can fire, and they won't be noticed in a way. So in other words, you just strip out the knowledge base within them, but you just make them implement. You don't fire the people taking in the rubbish or the school teachers, what have you. You fire the people who are doing so they know. So in a way, to my mind, that creates the possibility of greater linkages with the education sector. Say, actually, we might be able to fulfill some of your roles that you've lost. It's not a good situation to be in, but again, as I say, it's very much, this is the UK example. Conclusions, implications, and I'm supposed to finish at 2:30, right? So I'm almost bang on time. Complexity in science theory is well advanced, numerous academic work, all sorts of stuff you want to read on complexity in whatever field. Boy, it's great, it's marvelous. Key challenge, how to translate this research, theoretical knowledge, and action. In the UK, for me, I think, right, the impact agenda, that's our political in. We can use the impact agenda to say, here's how we as knowledge actors can link up with you, because we're supposed to be, we're in the universities being pummeled to show our impact. And you in the local government area, you're being squeezed so hard that you need knowledge actors to help you. So in a way, I'm trying to say the two are able to come together in that context. In my experience, policy actors generally agree the world is complex. I've rarely had a policy actor say to me, oh, no, it's simple. No, I've yet to meet one of those. But they often say that they're faced with pressures from above or below, meaning actors, the actors who want services delivered. They want it delivered in, you said you'd deliver it on time and in this way, and you didn't. What's the matter with you? Actors above them are often pressuring to say, well, you said you're supposed to do it on this time, you said this was going to be the output, and you failed. And so in a way, they often feel that they're caught having to act as a more orderly actor than they know is possible, but they kind of politically have to. For me, complexity is a way of challenging the UK centralizing tendency, but realize what you're up against. 100-odd years of this, it ain't going to shift easy. We're going to be realistic. And maybe it moves the culture, the media and society away from this culture of blame, control and blame. Again, you're talking about massive shift that would have to occur. So be realistic, be honest. Lots of tools, concepts to use. Key point for me, make them simple, make them useful for busy actors who have little time for theory. And believe me, if the C word is a problem, complexity, don't use it. Pick another word. Just interact with the actors, In other words, you can be a secret agent. You don't have to say you're a complexity, agent. Personal conclusion. Key isn't to play a complexity toolkit. It's sort of you type in complexity toolkits, a number of stuff will come up. Can be useful. Lots of stuff can be done in different situations. But in a way, I guess I've been personally really impressed with, once you create a positive, inclusive, in a sense, a pragmatic cultural complexity culture, if you can create that culture within the actors you're working with, where people are thinking, right, we can be reasonable, we can be adaptive, actually really good things, and they recognize the complex nature, and embrace this potential for reasonableness. Okay? You're not going to find the right answer. You're not going to find the final answer. That doesn't exist. Doesn't guarantee success, but increases the probability and creates a positive environment where even if you lose, you feel you gave it a reasonable shot. Right. The situation changes, you lose. You know, we put our 3 departments together, but the university itself collapses. Hey, we at least gave it a try and we thought we did the right thing. You can at least go at the end of the day and you know, sort of, at least you can leave with that, even if you've lost or the policy fails. Just one side of Trump. You know, this is the obvious monster in the room. And as a complexity person, I'm trying to come to grips with this. God, how on earth does this happen? Shock to the U.S. and the global political system. And what I say, and you see this in lots of cases, you have what is extrapolation tendency. Once a shock hits, you assume that's going to cause another shock, assume it's going to another shock, and you assume almost a domino effect. Brexit is a similar one to the EU. A lot of the language that comes out of Brexit is, well, if Brexit goes, who's next? And we'll, you know, you'll lead to this. No, the system immediately starts counter. You know, it's a monster complex adaptive system. The United States is a monster complex adaptive system with a governmental structure that has multiple checks and balances against itself. So for me, looking on the positive side, and it's interesting, it's important to recognize academics in the UK, so if you go to university level, there's this great debate between what are called the somewheres and the anywheres, and I'm trying to get my head around it. 90% of UK academics voted to remain in Europe. Okay? So in a way, our problem is we need to listen more to other than just academics, because one of our problems is we've got a built-in bias. We're a 90% bias. I remember we were having a big debate on Brexit in this one, and I remember sort of asking, did anybody in the room support Brexit? And we had 300 people, and nobody put up their hand. I said, well, how are we debating this? You know, we're all just agreeing with each other. So the good thing, looking at the positive side, societies are responsive, you know, the United States, Europe, these are healthy, complex, adaptive societies that are responding in a whole wave of ways at a macro, micro. U.S. marches, demonstrations, judicial counter-moves, short political coattails. I mean, Donald Trump's brand is now so toxic that a lot of actors are like, well, you know, even Republicans are like, steady on, let's keep some distance with this guy. And if you look at the way people are shaking hands with Trump, always likes to pull people in close and give them up. Several actors now, literally, when they go to shake hands with Trump, they go to avoid him putting his arm around and getting close. Watch the body language; it's marvelous. At least it makes me happy. External, U.S. as a destabilizer. Others are taking their place. If you look at China, climate change, free trade stuff, mixture of other countries on abortion rights. The United States pulled its money out of abortion rights. Can't remember the total number that jumped in saying, no, we're going to support this. And we've seen this before. If you watch when the US dollar delinked from gold, late 60s, early 70s, what generated the drive for the euro? It was the delinking of dollar. It was previously the dollar created the stabilizing structure. All the European economies link into it. Bang! The dollar delinks, becomes a destabilizer. The actors don't stand still. Tell you what, we need to organize in the face of this instability, and we'll create the concept of the euro. So the early concept of ERM was linked to this dollar destabilizer. So in a way, we're seeing this. We just had the recent Dutch election. That was very, very interesting. I'm not going to comment on that. The room, people are going to be much more expert on me, but in a sense, there you have the interesting implication, both in Brexit and with Trump, that that in essence counter forces are already organizing. And how do those counter forces do? So the system keeps moving. It doesn't stand still. You don't just have one domino tipping to one domino, etc. Finally, thank you for your time and attention. And always remember, this is I've always had this attributed to Derrida. If things were simple, word would have gotten round. You know, lots of bright people that are out there saying, you know what, actually this is simple. So no, you know, if it was simple, yeah, you know, people would have figured it out. But it isn't. It's complex. It's what we do. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that very encouraging lecture and showing us that the practice of complexity is actually everywhere, also in our day-to-day academic work, and how much fun it is to work with complexity.
I just be careful. I had a marvelous, or one of my colleagues said he'd seen this, and when I get into my complexity sort of go, I get excited. And he says, oh gosh, it's like watching an excitable puppy. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll try to calm down. But no, yes, I'm a convert, I'm a believer, and I must admit, you know, as somebody who's been working in it for 15, 16, 17 odd years, no, when I can get students to engage with it and get there, it is exciting to see a student's mind click and really sort of see, wow, the world does operate in this way. Or just to think in those larger things. But to me, it's always, how do you personalize it? How do you make it so that they can actually see it applying in their own life? Then, bang, you've got them. You know, then you can reel them in. You know. So no, I find that quite exciting. It's quite stimulating. And then, how do you link it into the stuff? So a lot I've gotten pulled into because. You know, I did well in this head of department thing. I got pulled into the associate dean thing, so I get pulled into how universities themselves function and structure. And yeah, actually, those same type of principles are battling themselves out of the various institutions that we're all working within. You know, so don't fool yourself that those above you are working along sort of coherent, rational lines. You know, they're battling it out with all these various processes and principles. So, our institutions are exactly the same. And the thing is, lots of the things of our institutions, it's the same processes, but happily, because I'm a coward, I'm really wimpy. I'd never be able to manage this in a hospital. I'm having a beer with my friend who's the chief executive officer of a hospital. Who do you spend the money on, elderly or the young? What's more important, breast cancer or prostate cancer? Should you increase your maternity ward for babies, or should you be spending more on social care for the elderly? These are life and death questions, and they're happening every day in your local hospital. No question. They're trying to adapt and adjust in the best way. And people's lives either are lengthened or shortened by that process. There's nasty bits. We're just, should such and such department grow a bit? And, hire a few over here, hire a few over there. So in a way, be thankful, at least for me, I'm thankful. Sorry, if you have questions, I'm very happy to take questions. But
we have
I'll keep answers short. So.
Yeah. We have a few minutes for questions before we go to the round table.
You're all stunned.
Okay. Well, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Just
So-
those two? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much for this very energetic talk. Absolutely. I'm heavily inspired. I was quite intrigued by this notion of a reflexive knowledge-based policy making. Could you mention some of the key ingredients for that?
All I see that is actually how do you create a relationship with local policy actors where you're interacting with them in a way where, in a sense, you're reflecting on them and they're reflecting on what you're bringing to the table as well. So we have a department of Lancaster Institute of Contemporary Arts that has a design element within it, and they do a lot of co-production design work with a woman by the name of Rachel Cooper. We're doing that. And they basically say, well, right, what you need to do, go with the actors, in a sense, going working with the local authority actors themselves, listening where you're on their context and their culture, and you're trying to respond in their time frame, their needs, etc. Where you're, in a sense, just by going there, you're able to taking a different frame of mind to them, but you're trying to establish a relationship of trust, because you're trying to say, well, why are because they're saying, why are we having this academic? It's a waste of time. This guy's going to say, how is this going to be working? They're playing political games. They're trying to get certain things. So in a way, just the process of you interacting with them, of you trying to learn with them, of you viewing this whole process with a broader frame, that they don't have the time to chase. So, the notion they're going to be reading books on complexity, forget it. At least the ones I've been dealing with, they're lucky if they go to the movies. And so in essence, I view it as our job to try to, we as academics, engaged academics, trying to make complexity living, take that reflexive process and make that real. Please.
Sorry, I have a bad question because it's way too broad. But it comes to how you're speaking about complexity, sort of questioning how you're defining the term.
It, yeah.
Because it seems when you're talking about it that you're using it in ways very similar to uncertainty. And then I'm sort of questioning whether that is the most productive way to speak about it, because feels to me there is complex systems do have principles by which they have emergent outcomes that are very productive, that are not just completely uncertain.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering if you can comment on that, because you didn't really you spoke a little bit about definitions of complexity at the start, but it felt like it was more analogous to
No, I agree. I see exactly. The way I try to teach it, the way I try to think about it, and I don't want to go into, and this is very influenced by Prigogine and Stenger, lots of people much smarter than me. And in a way, I was trying to mentally, and I've got a map that I sort of draw out. I view it as, in a sense, 5 boxes, or 5 on a spectrum. And on the one hand, you have the highly orderly stuff. This is your gravity. This is where your strict quantitative approaches, your high levels of predictability are there. And then in a way, I then say, okay, I then move over to a level of, say, let's call it physical complexity, where you're dealing with sand piles, which you're dropping sand piles, you're seeing avalanche effects. So you still have high degrees of probability, high degrees of predictability. You're starting to bring in uncertainty into the system. You're starting to bring in probability, where you're saying, look, actually, in essence, the sand pile will go to a certain level. It'll then hover at that level for a while, but it'll depend. When we can create models on that, we can do things. Next layer over, I think, if you will, is biological complexity, which is to say, okay, here we have emergent phenomena. So allow a virus to survive over a certain time. It will develop properties, will transform it into a different thing. Allow human beings to emerge over time, blah, blah, blah. And so in other words, again, boundaries are there. You can use some degree of predictability, but over time, your probabilities grow. This was one of my favorite guy, Peter Allen, who used to write, said, complex systems are like throwing a duck. And for a short period of time, they're highly predictable. You extend the time frame, and the duck can fly anywhere. Then I tend to move it. So you've got, in a sense, pure order, physical complexity, biological. Then you move into human, if you will, narrative complexity. What are the narratives that we create to understand our world? All of a sudden, you're getting much higher degrees of uncertainty, unpredictability. Your time scale of knowing what's the narrative going to be in a particular organization in 2 weeks' time, 6 months' time, etc. So in a way, I see that going over. And then you move into a high, if you will, almost a high uncertainty zone, where all these things are combining to high degrees of unpredictability. Data collection is really poor. Your ability to model them is really, really limited. High degrees of uncertainty. And then I say, all those things are occurring in your life right now. You have highly orderly elements that are occurring within you. You have physical complex elements that are bubbling around in your body, blood flows, blockages like traffic flows. You've got biological things that are emerging as well. You're moving in, your own narrative is being shaped at the same time, and unpredictable events are going to be hitting you all the time. Now, which of those levels is the most important? So my argument is, they're all part of the structure. You can't create a hierarchy saying, actually, these on the quantitative end are the really important ones. We've got to understand these. Recognizing that understanding the chaotic zone, that part, in a way, recognizing that that's really hard. And it's virtually unknown. The example I like was from a social worker. Sorry, I said I wouldn't talk. One of my favorite stories was a social worker, or that one quote, and I can't remember whether it's Prigogine, is complex systems like walking through a maze where the walls change with every step you take. Well, imagine if the walls are changing really fast. And the example was a social worker who goes to visit in a deprived area, a woman with addiction issues, health issues. She's got 2 children, and she was going there with a mandate to say, right, you need to get her to stop smoking, because that's the biggest impact on her life, on the baby's life, etc. So she goes in there and she basically says to the woman, look, here's the normal health sort of things. You try to stop smoking. To which the mother says, straight face, look, the only thing I do, smoking relaxes me. If I quit smoking, I'd throw my baby out the window. Now, what should the social worker do? Well, if she'd followed a good evidence-based model, she would reassert the importance of stopping smoking and you're harming your baby, etc. The maze has shifted on her. So what does she do this was an experience in here. In that zone, intuition, actually, experience and intuition are almost the only things you can draw upon. She says, right, I'll bring you a pack of cigarettes next time. Gains the trust of the person. Takes time, no way would that have been put in the, in the handbook. Gains the trust of the person, shows up with cigarettes next time, they have a chat, and over time she's able to work with that. She doesn't solve the person. The person still is, struggles with drug addiction and all these other things. But in essence, she quickly does that. And so that's where the emphasis I say, you've got to avoid tipping it into quantitative order at the top, evidence-based policy. This is your evidence-based policy making, and the uncertain, messy bits at the bottom, and try to let's wedge everything we can up into that because somehow that's going to make it better. I said, no, that to me, that's the rule in complexity. No, that's wrong. And in a sense, that's our job, is to try to convince people that ain't going to solve it. It's nice, it's good. Of course we should collect more evidence. Of course we should get this stuff. But the minute we elevate that to the gold standard, which is often used in the terms from medicine, evidence-based medicine is often seen as the highest level. Whereas the reality is, actually there's all sorts of conditions, the diabetes as well, where the interaction of the person's personality into the process of managing their diabetes is actually as important as the insulin itself. So, sorry, too long. Please.